Thank you very much. So this is a joint work with Nitai Bergman, my longtime co-author, and two of my former students at Harvard University. The paper is about a question of the externalities that are being generated by financial distress and bankruptcy. Usually when we think about distress, we think about what is happening to the firms themselves, and this is where most of the literature is. You know, we wrote a paper a few years ago about the externalities that are being generated to firms that are in the same industry. And here we are trying to identify another channel of externalities. Externalities can be positive or negative, and I'm going to discuss that. We do it in the context of retail. And we look into what we call agglomeration effects. So first, let me just very briefly talk about agglomeration. Agglomeration is the notion that when economic units are producing in proximity to each other, productivity seems to be higher. So there is evidence, mostly from manufacturing, that firms tend to collocate next to each other, and that collocation seems to increase productivity. There is no one model of agglomeration. So let me say up front that we didn't even take an attempt to model the nature of the agglomeration here, because that one can think about many dimensions. It can be a shared labor market, it can be a shared resource, etc. It can be spillover of knowledge. We didn't do that in this context. The argument about agglomeration goes back to Marshall, has been developed further by economists, a lot of empirical evidence, especially by Ed Glazer in the context of manufacturing. And we argue that at least in retail, agglomeration would lead to a downturn. And the idea is that stores tend to locate next to each other. They benefit from the collocation. The idea is that consumers would like to come to retail clusters where they can purchase from multiple vendors, from multiple retailers. And once this linkage is broken because that some stores exit, then the others suffer. Now, usually the knee-jerk reaction that we get to this argument is that, what about competition? Won't I be better off if my competitor next to me is actually going to exit? And what most of us have in mind is a model, an industrial organization model, in the spirit maybe of sale-op, in which we are trying to maximize local monopoly. And the prediction usually of this model, especially if we think about the product differentiation as term of distance, is that we would like to be as further away from each other as we could to create the local monopolies. There is only one problem with this model, is that there are hardly any retail structures in the world that conform to this prediction. Most retail structures in the world, and you can imagine every mall or any other retail structure that you have in mind, tend to cluster together, and not in a diversified way. Actually, direct competitors are located next to each other. So a week ago, I was in Istanbul, and in the Grand Bazaar, you have the Bazaar of the spices, and you have the Bazaar of the gold, and all of the competitors are next to each other. A shopping mall is nothing more than just an agglomeration cluster, because that a shopping mall is mostly apparel, mostly clothes, and they are next to each other. Apparently, there is some rationale to be located next to each other. The leading model for that is a model by Asher Wolinski in Rand from the 1980s. And the argument is that there is some imperfect information, and consumers would have some taste for diversity. They would like to go to a large cluster and shop around. And again, think about many extreme examples. The Diamond District in New York is in one street. The Diamond District in Chicago is in one building. Okay, so there are reasons to believe that that's the case. The argument that we make, which has been very common during the crisis by many mall owners, that once some stores leave them, once the occupancy rate of the mall drops below 90 or 85%, many other stores would like to leave as well, because that consumers do not want to come, which eventually lead to the demise of the mall. So this is the argument that we have here. We are looking for a shock in which we can argue that the exit of a store from a cluster, doesn't have to be a mall, we have basically all retail clusters in the US, has nothing to do with the local economic condition in that case, and use this as a way to identify the effect of stores that leave on the next stores that would leave as well. So the best way to illustrate our empirical design And most of our result is with the following figure. And what you see here, you see a mole. And again, the paper is not only about moles, but that's an easy way to describe what we do. And you see here, store number 11 is Best Buy. So Best Buy didn't file for bankruptcy yet. But let's imagine that they do. What we ask is the following. What will happen to the neighboring stores? Are they also likely to exit? What about store 12? What about store 14? We are going to measure it as a function of the distance between the stores. We are going to measure it as a function of the size of the store that is in the receiving end. We are going to argue that a larger store is going to be more resilient. And we are going to study it as a function of the deep pockets that the store has. So, if I'm a neighbor of Best Buy, and in headquarters we hear that Best Buy is about to leave, we know that sales are going to dwindle in this location. The decision whether to leave or not is, can we weather the storm for the next year? If we have deep enough pockets, perhaps we can do that. This is basically what we do. And the answer to all of these questions is that stores are more likely to live. Stores are more likely to live the closer they are to me. Stores are less likely to live if they are bigger. Stores are less likely to live if in the headquarters we have enough financial resources. So it all makes kind of intuitive sense. So first, let me give you a sense of the nature of store closings in the US. What we plotted here is the blue dots are stores that either exist by the end of the year, the end of 2007, or opened up during 2007. And the red stores are those that closed down during the year. This looks like a typical year in decent times in the US. You have churning of about 4 to 5% of the stores. 4 to 5% of the store closed down, and roughly the same magnitude or slightly higher would open up. Now, of course, during the recession, the situation was very different, and about 10 to 12% of the stores have closed down, and only 3 to 4% have reopened. Now, we are not going to argue that, of course, what we study here is not the driver of the closure of the stores. There was a recession. There was a decline in consumption. There are many other issues. But we are going to study. We have enough variation here such that we can utilize it for our study. So I showed you a picture for the US. Here is a state that I know quite well, Illinois. This is Chicago. This is St. Louis. And this is Kansas City. And this is 2007. And here is 2008. Now, let me just tell you one thing, that when you see a red dot, it doesn't mean that all of the stores in that location closed down, because that you might have 20 or 30 stores in the same location or even more. Whenever we have a closure, the upper layer would be, the top layer would be red, just for illustration. So almost in every location you had closures. It doesn't mean that all of the stores in Illinois have closed down. Okay, so what is the empirical challenge? This is just an application of peer effect study. And then the question is, can we actually identify in a credible way a peer effect? Let's say that I have two stores, store I and store J, and store I and J are neighbors. And I'm going to look into an outcome for store I. Ideally, we wanted to have sales at the store level. And we bought that data. Apparently, that data was all imputed, in the sense that what most of the vendors do, they take the total sales of the chain divided by the total square footage of the chain and multiply it by the square footage of the store. And when we ran the regression, we saw that the results were completely collinear with size. And then when we investigated, we realized that was the case. So if you want to buy this data, 4 different vendors, and they all do the same shtick. Instead, what we do is we have information about the stores that close. That's going to be a more of an extreme outcome, but that's the only credible outcome that we can look into. So Y is going to be a dummy variable, or I, in which store I closes down. And we have a neighboring store, store J, that closes down as well. Maybe we can have a time subscript here of t minus 1. So we are going to run the regression. If store I closes after store J is closing, they are neighbors. And we can control for the characteristics of store I. And let's say that we find a positive and significant beta. 2 interpretations. One of them, we have contagion. J causes I. And the other one, it's nothing about contagion. There was some local economic shock that affected both J and I. And this is just correlation. It tells us something about the local economic condition, but there is no causal effect. We spend all of the energy that we had for the paper on trying to identify a causal effect here, trying to make a causal effect. Let me describe you what is the method that we are using. So this is just that. So the solution that we had initially, thought maybe the solution would be to look into bankruptcy cases, because that in bankruptcy cases, the decision to close a store is more at the headquarters. But that's not a good idea because at most bankruptcy cases end up in reorganization. And what you do in reorganization, you get rid of your less performing assets. So you close down the stores. Which stores do you close down? The less performing stores, we are back to square one. Instead, what we did, and that's the fortune that we had during the recession, if you do research in financial distress, then a recession comes very handy, is that there were more than 20 retail chains that were quite successful. They all failed for endogenous reasons, and we argue that none of the chains failed because of the location of the individual stores. And once they failed and filed for bankruptcy, they completely evaporated. They do not exist anymore. So Circuit City is a good example. It was the second largest electronics retailer in the US, had presence in all over the US. Right? When you don't see any dots here, it's not because that they are missing something. It's basically because that no one lives there. And then, because of bad management, because of many other reasons, Circuit City disappears. So we are going to show you that the location of Circuit City was not worse than any of their competitors. Even though one can find in the internet some claims that Circuit City failed because of the location, we confirm that that's not the case. And then what we are going to do is we are going to look into the effect of the closure of Circuit City on the neighboring stores, given all of the conditions that we had before. Circuit City is only one retailer here. We have about 20 different chains. Linen and Thin is another example. Linen and Thin, the second largest seller of linen and things after Bed Bath & Beyond. What do? They do an LBO, 6. 80% debt ratio, not a good idea. They couldn't foresee that a recession was coming. Of course, they cannot service the debt. They cannot sustain it. And we have many other examples for cases like this. Borders would be a good example. Borders fail because that there is a decline in book sales. And they don't develop the Nook. They don't develop any reader. But the location of Borders are actually prime locations. So this is what we need. We need cases in which the decision to close and the disappearance of the stores has nothing to do with the local economic conditions. We can go and verify that the local economic conditions are not that different from others. And so this is, I apologize, this is not in the paper. This is a little bit hot from the press, but here is one univariate analysis. We also do it in multivariate sense, is that you can pick up almost any economic indicator. Here we have log-adjusted gross income, either the zip code or the county level, and compare it between a firm that undergoes bankruptcy and full liquidation, like Circuit City, and a direct competitor, Best Buy, that survives, or Linen and Thin and Bed Bath & Beyond, or the Sharper Image and Brookstone. Brookstone also filed for bankruptcy a couple of weeks ago. You can see that there is a level difference between the locations, but there is no difference in the quality of the location between Circuit City and its direct competitor. And this is basically something that that we have done. Again, it's not in the current draft, in terms of unemployment, home prices growth, income growth, any other socio-demographic dimension. They all seem to be very, very well balanced. So that's encouraging. And then what we are going to do is we are going to take every store in the US. The data here is the chain store guide, which is basically almost every store that belongs to a chain in the US. And we measure the distance. This is not the physical distance. This is the distance between the addresses, between that store and any of the neighboring store. We do it in increments of 50 meters. And we basically run a non-parametric analysis that tries to see, am I more affected by the stores that are nearby? Again, when you see the same address, it doesn't mean that the physical distance is 0. Physical distance can be 100 or 150 meters, okay? But it's close by. I know that in asset pricing, when Koval and Moskovich have written their influential paper, they also took into account the curvature of Earth in measuring distance. We didn't do it because we thought that the curvature of Earth is not a big deal in 50 meters increments. But again, it might not be 50 meters. It can be 100 or 150 in some cases. So basically, what is happening to the right green square here, if there is a closure here, if there are closures here, if there are closures here. So we have these concentric rings that we study. Here's a summary of the effects. I'm always going to mention the specification that using year and zip code fixed effects, even though we have some specification with state, with county, and some specification would also include more fixed effect. A closure of a store next to me is increasing the likelihood that I will close by 11% relative to the unconditional mean. That's a sizable amount. If you really want to extrapolate, which I don't like to do, if I was really unlucky to be a neighbor of the maximum number of stores that close down next to me, and the max is 3. So I was a neighbor of Circuit City and Linen and Thing, and you know, some let's say the sharper image, then the effect can be very sizable. But of course, I don't want to extrapolate a linear effect. What are the components of the identification strategy? We verified 20 to 30 cases in which we know that these are national chains. They operate in several states. The smallest number of states is 8. They are not exposed only to one part of the country. And that we have reliable evidence, even though sometimes you have some misleading reports, that they didn't fail because of the location. We verify that the location are not worse than other chains. We conduct placebo test, which is basically, do I see any exit of stores next to Circuit City before Circuit City files for bankruptcy? It's like an event study in corporate finance here. If there is something wrong about the location of Circuit City, I should see exit all the time from there, you know, and there is none. If anything, it goes the other way. And then we look into localized effect, and that's a key part of our identification, because at any store that you would like to tell us about a local economic shock, it has to be confined to 100 meters, but not to the next 100 meters. And that's an important part of it, because that we can differentiate in very fine measurement. And eventually, we add heterogeneity to the response of stores, which is one of the key things that one should do in the context of peer effects, which is to sort stores based on some ex-ante characteristics of sensitivity to closures, like size or profitability or industry, and see whether this predetermined sorting affect the outcome, and they do. I'm less likely to close if at the headquarters I'm more profitable. Or another result that is not reported in the paper, if there is more leverage at the headquarters, then I'm more likely to close. Okay? Now, you know, with some, I'm more likely to close if the store is smaller, but I'm less likely to close if my store is bigger. The data comes from Chain Store Guide, so it has a very good coverage, and this is just the way that the data looks over time. And just to give you a sense of some of the analysis, here are the chains. Here are some of the chains. You can see that they have many stores in many states. In most of the country, the maximum number of census division is 9. And the analysis also holds when we only confine the analysis to 9 census divisions. Here is how they look like. We use the Circuit Cities, the Linen and Things, the sharper images. This is how the regressions look like. So look into column 4. This is a linear probability model that asks basically what is the likelihood that I'm closing given that there are more closures near me in the same address. Again, same address can be up to 150 meters. And the answer is that relative to the conditional mean, which is around 6%, is 10%. Okay? So I'm not going to show here all of the analysis. But one of the things, so I told you that usually people have 2 reactions to the paper. The first one is, what about competition? And I would say that maybe some aspects of competition, and remember I've been indoctrinated at the University of Chicago, are overrated compared to the value of agglomeration. The second one is that how can we aggregate this effect? Maybe the only thing that is happening here is that the business moves from one mall to another mall. There is a negative externality in this mall. There is a positive externality in the other mall. That's definitely a possibility. In some tests which are not reported here, when we aggregate the results along 2 dimensions, one of them is along the dimension of the firms. Firms that are more exposed to closures tend to close more stores at the aggregate, tend to lose profit, and tend to lose money. We also do aggregation at the county level. Counties that happen to have more closures are also more likely to see decline in expenditure and in economic condition. Now, I'm not crazy about this aggregation because that obviously I think that the power of what we do here is the data and the micro nature of the data that enable us to do the identification. But this at least suggests that the results may well be stand up the aggregation. So, we are now working on a major revision. We have some additional tests. I didn't want to show all of them here because that they are not, many of them are not in the draft that I have sent. The key issue that we are dealing now is to see what is happening in terms of aggregation and whether we can make a convincing case that the effect aggregate. But even if the effect doesn't aggregate, still, here is an externality that is within the mall. Had many conversations with mall owners and developers. That's a key concern for mall owners, because once the occupancy rate is declining, many of the other stores can basically exit as well, and several malls have collapsed because of the domino effect of that. So we are interested in real estate and commercial real estate here, but we want to tell here a case of contagion and financial contagion. Thank you very much.